Thank you for having me. Um, I come here today not as an expert on the political situation or the history of Afghanistan, but as someone who has worked in different capacity with women in Afghanistan, and I'm now in constant contact with a number of women who have not been able to get out, and of women who have. Um, Through our survivors group that we have with the I Do project, we have survivors of forced marriage, and a number of them are from Afghanistan. And this is how a lot of the women who've contacted me have come to my attention, is through members of our group. And I've also got other international cases from particular people who work on forced marriage around the world, who called me about situations of friends of theirs in Afghanistan who were being forced into a marriage because their families didn't know what else to do, because the Taliban was often abducting women and forcing them into marriages. So then their family wanted to force them to marry at least someone that they knew. So the situation in Afghanistan is very difficult. I'm going to share my screen. So I've taken the title Forsaken from Lana Slick's book of photographs that she did. She's a Canadian photographer and filmmaker who did a book of beautiful photographs from women in Afghanistan. And this was done many years ago. But the women, this is not new for the women in Afghanistan to feel that they have been forsaken by the world. I mean, there's so many other things going on in the world. We're especially focused on Ukraine, but nothing has changed for the better for women in Afghanistan. Okay. Just not sure whether, do I have full capacity to move the slides?
You should. That's yeah, that should be a thing just on your own computer, I think.
Okay. So women in Afghanistan, like women in pretty well all patriarchal countries, including Canada and the US, had to fight to get their rights. And Afghanistan has been at war for a long time, with little patches of peace here and there. But by the 1950s, women had the right for higher education, to get into universities, and to be in the workforce. This is a picture from Kabul. You might have seen pictures like this in the 1970s. This is women in the large cities going to university and working. I'm still having a little trouble switching the slides, but let's see. Okay. This is what women outside of the large cities tended to dress like. I'm not trying to reduce women to the attire, but it does tell a really poignant story of women's lives. And Afghanistan was mostly a rural country, and this is how women would dress in the rest of the country. Very colorful and with beautiful and intricate embroidery. I have a bookmark that I was given that the women had made, and it's just incredible, just for a tiny bookmark, to see the beautiful embroidery that they put forward into it. When the Taliban came to power in 1996, I believe, things changed really drastically for the worse. The burqa was not the attire of women in Afghanistan. It was a very small, very particular branch of religion that the Taliban brought forward. And all of a sudden women in the entire country who had had previous to this the rights to go to school, the rights to work, were pushed back and forced to wear the burqa and forced into all kinds of other limitations on their lives. And at this point, women in Afghanistan were constantly calling out to the world, and no one seemed to care. They felt forsaken by the world, that no one cared. And there is a tendency we see around the world from patriarchy where men's problems and the way that men are treated is treated as oppression, and women, when women are abused in similar ways, it's treated as tradition. Even when, as we can see in the case of Afghanistan, it didn't have anything to do with tradition. There were even some feminists in around the world, including Michelle Landsberg, who had a column in the Toronto Star at the time, saying that we needed to get together a women's army and go to Afghanistan to free the women. I was at the time working with a group called the Catherine Collective, and we were working to smuggle teachers into Afghanistan. We worked with the revolutionary, the RAWA, the Revolutionary Association of Women in Afghanistan, and through them we were smuggling teachers in to teach girls in secret, and opening a health clinic for women, because their health was deteriorating rapidly, because they were not really supposed to be seeing under the Taliban to see a male doctor, and women doctors had often been kicked out of their jobs. So we had opened the clinic, and it was, some of the members had gone into Afghanistan. It was a very difficult time. Then we all know about 9/11, and things changed to a certain degree. But this had nothing to do with freeing the women of Afghanistan. They'd been calling for help for a long time. However, when the powers that be, when the Americans were going in, they were able to frame part of their operation in Afghanistan as freeing women. The women weren't exactly freed, but NGOs were able to come into the country, and women were able to get a little bit of freedom. This is a picture from Lana Suzek's book on women in Afghanistan, and this is Malala Kakar. She is a woman who, with the police force in Afghanistan, so women were able to go, in some cases, back into the workforce. And she had a special position on domestic violence and bringing perpetrators to justice, because under the Taliban, there was no justice for women. Women could be beaten and killed with no repercussions. This is a picture of her, but this is in 2000. In 2008, she was assassinated by the Taliban. So this time, I don't want to give the impression that all of a sudden women were totally free and they didn't face any discrimination. Of course, they still did. And when we go forward to when the Taliban came back into this is a more recent photograph when the Taliban came roaring back into power. There were terrible repercussions for women, because men who had been jailed for beating or killing their wives or other such forms of violence against women were freed. So women, for a number of reasons, had to go back into hiding again. And this is the situation for women in Afghanistan. The women that I'm dealing with, that I'm speaking to through WhatsApp and messaging services, I once again feel that they've been forsaken by the world. I mean, the Americans pulled out without much notification being given to their countries. They were unable to get people out, even the people that they had promised, such as people who worked for the Canadian government or in the embassies or with the military. And we've been working on this ever since, in conjunction with other groups. The Canadian government did immediately recognize that vulnerable Afghans should be given the option to come to Canada as refugees. And women is one group. Just being a woman puts you at tremendous risk in Afghanistan. Along with LGBTQ people, members of religious minorities, such as Hazaras. I have one woman who is Hazara, but nothing really is happening. So at the start, when this first happened, the Canadian government pledged to take in about 20,000 refugees from Afghanistan. And along with other groups, which were led by the Canadian Women for Women in Afghanistan, we pressured the government to raise the number that they would bring out of the country. And relatively quickly, they doubled the number that they were willing to take, which was 40,000. So we were hoping that as they'd made that move quite quickly, that we would be able to get more women out. But as it stands now, there have not even been 10,000 people, vulnerable people, brought out from Afghanistan. And I've spoken to a guy with the Canadian military who is working on getting those people and their families out that the Canadian government had promised would get out. As I said, interpreters and people who worked for the Canadian government. And a lot of them have not so far been able to get out. One of the big problems is that for refugees, they're taking down a lot of rules for Ukrainians and making it easier for them to get to Canada. But the big difference in Afghanistan is to be declared a refugee. What you have to do is you have to flee the country, you have to get out of the country, and then the United Nations, UNHCR, has to declare you, has to determine that you are a refugee, and then you get your refugee card. Well, in Afghanistan, unlike in the situation in the Ukraine, the borders have been closed. Pakistan closed their border. Iran had closed their border. You couldn't get into Uzbekistan without a letter from the Canadian government, which we don't seem to be able to get. Women are unable to flee the country. One of the young women I was talking to, she made a desperate attempt to get over the border in Pakistan, but she wasn't allowed in, and she was beaten by the Taliban. And she's desperate. She's just feeling desperate. She's had to move out of Kabul with her family because they're too much risk. I've had a young woman sending me all her pictures of her playing sports, because if they were found on her phone or any device that she had, that is violating all the rules that the Taliban have for what women are allowed to do. So I advised her to send the pictures to me and then remove them from her computer. So with the situation that we have there, we've been calling for the Canadian government to make an exception for people fleeing Afghanistan, that they could flee directly from the country without having to go to another country, because it's almost impossible to get across the border, even if you have the resources to do so. And most people don't. Women have been kicked out of their jobs, they've been kicked out of schools. And one woman I was speaking to was the Taliban had murdered her brother because he'd been working with the foreign government. So that's a cause for being murdered. And she was supporting his children and his family as well as her own, and she was kicked out of her job. So there's no support. So a lot of families are in this situation. And in our particular case, I'm working with these women who are inside Afghanistan, but I'm feeling rather desperate about what we can do for them unless we can get the Canadian government to change this. So for those who are interested in helping in something like that, I could send you a link for the Canadian Women for Women in Afghanistan's website, just to send a message to the government. It has a list of the demands, and this is a main demand. We also have one woman that I've been connected to who was able to get out of the country before the Taliban took over. And she has been declared a refugee in India, where she's living without any support because the Indian government does not financially support refugees. And now she had been getting a bit of money from her family in Afghanistan, but now that's impossible, as they have no money. So we're trying to bring her to Canada. We started a group of 5, but we do need a couple more people. I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with the group of 5, but that's a way of sponsoring a refugee. It's a group of 5 or more people who commit to assisting the individual when they get to Canada for a year. In her case, we've been able to line up financial resources. We've been able to get 2 employers who have agreed to employ her when she comes to Canada, and we've been able to get housing. So there's not really much of a financial commitment. It's just getting the people on paper. So if anyone is interested in assisting her, that would be greatly appreciated. I don't know how to translate what these women are feeling through just my words. Because when you're on the phone with someone and when you can hear the desperation in their voices and you feel helpless. So this is one of the things that I'm concentrating on, because this is one individual that I can help. I had already signed on to a group of 5 for a family of 6. This is just one individual. And this is really what I want to get across to people, because it's so easy, and this happens all the time in the world. There's one crisis, and then all the media is focused on that crisis, and then something else happens and we move on to that. But things are not any better for the women in Afghanistan. In fact, they're getting worse. I mean, the Taliban has made a number of announcements that they would stop forced marriage, which of course they have done nothing about. And they're trying to get recognized by other countries, which is why they're putting these things forward. But as the Afghans here, I'm saying, is don't believe anything anyone's saying, even a person in Afghanistan who is saying that they're pro-Taliban, because this is what you have to do to survive. I mean, we see this kind of thing in a lot of countries. We're seeing it now in Russia, where if people are protesting the treatment the government's war into the Ukraine, of course, they can be arrested. 14,000 of them have been arrested just for standing there protesting. And in Afghanistan, the government has even more control over people's lives. And so this type of situation is just heartbreaking. And while I'm not an expert, I'm just an individual who has been trying for all these years to help women in Afghanistan. We thought maybe we were making a bit of progress, but everything has gone backwards. As Janice was reading, in the reading she was saying, the clock has been turning back. So we want her to move forward, not just for daylight savings time, but for women's lives. So I think I've come to the end of what of my time allotment. So I just urge you, if anyone is willing to help by writing letters or by being part of the group of 5, or by whatever way that you connect, whether you connect through prayer, or any other way that you want to assist. I mean, there is some humanitarian aid getting into Afghanistan. That's not going to particularly help women's situation. However, a lot of people are at risk of famine. In fact, 98% of people in Afghanistan now do not have enough to eat. So in whatever way you would like to help, it would be greatly appreciated by everyone there. So thank you for having me, and for caring about the situation of women in Afghanistan. Thank you.